So now that I've given you an overview of the QuoteServices architecture with its various elements, let's zero in on one piece of that architecture, which is the Eureka microservice structure and functionality. And this particular functionality is used to provide discovery services, discovery capabilities. The code for this part, for this module, for this microservice, is almost entirely declarative. There's almost nothing you actually have to write with your Java chops intact. You do it mostly through configuration and declaration in YAML files, which we'll see. So first of all, what is Eureka? Well, Eureka is a super clever name for a discovery service. And the reason for that is because Eureka is what Archimedes claims to have said when he understood, I think it was the volume of water, if I'm not mistaken. And he said Eureka, and Eureka meant I have found it. So what better name for a discovery service than Eureka? Because you're going to find stuff with that. So that's what Eureka is. What it does is it enables an API gateway, such as our gateway we're using for the quotes service, to find and communicate with back-end microservices, where you have this Eureka microservice that's running, or server, and then the microservices register, and then they connect and so on, without having to hard code ports and host names into your code. There's various ways to do this. You can let Eureka pick the port numbers for you. You can provide the port numbers. There are different ways to do it, but we don't have to hard code stuff. We definitely don't have to hard code the numbers, the port numbers into the client code for sure. That's a really nice benefit. Now, for this to work, of course, the Eureka microservice has to start prior to the microservices that use it. So it needs to be the first thing, or one of the first things that comes up when you launch your services. So if you look at the run script that we have for this program and for your next assignment, you'll see that Eureka is always the one that begins first. It implements something that's known as a server-side discovery pattern. There's client-side discovery, and there's server-side discovery. Client-side discovery, you can think of client-side discovery in various ways, but that could be used to actually perhaps find the port number and host address of the gateway. That would be client-side discovery. How does it know that? Either it's hard-coded or it uses a discovery service to look things up. Server-side discovery, of course, is used for microservice architectures, typically, where you want to be able to allow a bunch of microservices to start up in the background and then have a gateway that can use Eureka or some other discovery service to discover the microservices when it needs to use them in response to incoming client requests. So the basic idea here is we have these different microservices that start up and they register themselves with a service registry, such as Eureka, and then that can be used for the gateway to discover those clients, without having to, the services rather, without having to know the details about them other than their names. So the idea here is you can be blissfully unaware. You can have this so-called black box, which just means that you don't have to know how things are implemented in the back end, and that can become an implementation detail, which is great because it takes away yet another source of mistakes in the code that you might write. So let's talk a little bit about the structure and the functionality of the Eureka microservice. So the way it works, the way we use it in our program and the way you would normally use it in any other program that used Eureka, is you have the back-end microservices registering with the Eureka service repository when the back-end microservices start up. And you can read about the service registry discussion here. So basically, you have the server registry, which is an instance of Eureka. And then you have different services, which would be the microservices that come along and register with Eureka. Say, here I am, this is my name, this is my port number, and so on. Or you can let Eureka choose the port number for you. And then you can also later have other clients, which could be a gateway, for example, discover where those microservices are registered by querying the registry and saying, hey, here's a name that just came in. Is there a microservice that happens to implement this particular name? Question mark. And if the answer is yes, then you get the client, which in this case would be the gateway, gets back the connection information needed to contact that microservice. Here's how we use it in our system. When the gateway, the Handy application, and the Zippy application start up, they will register themselves with the Eureka microservice, which of course is why it has to be launched first. If you launch that later, they're not going to be able to register properly. The QuoteServices Eureka microservice is configured almost entirely declaratively. And there's other ways to do this, but this is the way that most people do it nowadays. Remember what declarative means? It means that you say what you want, not how to do it, and therefore there's less things to go wrong once you understand how to write things declaratively. So one way we do the declarative expression is through annotations. So here is the Eureka application, which pretty much just looks like that. And it has a @enable Eureka server annotation added to it. And that informs Spring, make this a Eureka server, please. And then it'll go and find the associated property files and so on to do the right thing. Speaking of property files, here's the property file that we have. So this is a YAML file. Remember, YAML ain't a markup language, which is goofy, but whatever. And so this is what is used to configure the Eureka server microservice. And you can see this if you go look at this file in my GitHub repository. So we say this server will listen on this port, 8761, and it's got the name Eureka. So that's its name. And then down here, we give some information to Eureka. We say, to configure the Eureka server, don't register yourself with Eureka. Duh. Don't fetch the repository because you own it. And just go ahead and put yourself into something called the default zone, which says kind of the span of control over which this thing applies. It has a host name and a port number and stuff like that. So that's the property file that we use. So you can see that there's really hardly any code here. And then what you see here is other code. This would be like, this would be code that would be for the handy application microservice, or the zippy application microservice, or the gateway application microservice. Those things are also going to be declaratively saying, I want to use Eureka. I want to be a Eureka client. So I'm a client, and I'm going to register with Eureka, and I want to get the registry, please. So all this information is what's provided by annotation files. In this case, it's another YAML file for the gateway, but it's the same is true for the handy application microservice, the zippy application microservice, and so on. And this is how we register to be a client of Eureka. So here's how Eureka service defines itself to be a server. Here's how clients register with it. It's a little bit confusing, but I'll show you some interesting stuff here a little bit later where you can learn more about how this works and how to understand its behavior. The QuoteService API gateway, the one that we're using for our QuoteServices application, uses Eureka to locate the other microservices that it encapsulates, that it hides from the client, by the names of those microservices. And we'll see how that works here shortly. And so once it figures out where the other applications are, the microservices are, when it receives requests, it transparently forwards those requests to the designated microservice. And we'll take a closer look at that in just a moment when we talk about the gateway microservice architecture. OK, so that's the end of the overview of the Eureka microservice. Eureka is not the only discovery service you can use, but it's a very common one. I think it was created by Netflix, if I'm not mistaken. And it's easy to use and very powerful, and we're going to use it for this example and also for your next programming assignment.